Welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me yet in this series of webinars, I'm Anna Proskurina. I work at Democracy International as academic project and communication officer. And especially I closely work with our project Direct Democracy Navigator. We have Klaus Hoffmann today, its founder. Yes, but so this is a database of direct democracy tools around the world. And of course, this means we have the academic direction of work, like updating the tools in the database. But at the same time, we want to share this knowledge with other people in the scientific community, but also to civil society activists or just interested citizens. And this is where these webinars come into play. This is the fourth one this year that we have organized. And yeah, a bit later in the chat, I will share with you the links to all of the previous webinars and to the navigator itself. But today, as you all know, we have gathered to talk about direct democracy in small island states, the topic that we somehow never put in the center of attention yet. And so we are fixing it today. And to do that, we have invited two speakers. The first one to speak today is Dr. Caroline Morris, a professor of constitutional law and the director of the Center for Small Island States for Queen Mary University of London. And she's joined by Professor Peter Edge, a member of the Center for Global Politics, Economy and Society at Oxford Brookes University. Thank you both very much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to your inputs. And without any further delays, Caroline, the stage is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, all the way from a hotel room in Sussex, where I'm taking some holiday, but also obviously joining you for the seminar, which I'm really delighted to do. So I thought perhaps I'd just start by giving a quick overview of how Peter and I have decided to divide up the seminar. I'm going to be taking more of an overview, so just looking at some of the foundational questions that we ask, some of the issues that we need to address when we're looking at small states, and I'll say small states here just for brevity, because although we're talking about small island states, most small states are in fact islands, because they are typically clustered in either the Pacific or the Caribbean. In fact, I think that Europe, the continent of Europe, contains the most non-island small states in the category of small states. So small island states and small states, there is a great deal of overlap. So I'm going to be talking about some of the perhaps more conceptual issues, some of the definitional issues, some of the reasons why we'd want to have this field of inquiry to begin with. And I will give some examples along the way, but I think my colleague Professor Edge will really do the deep dive into how the politics and the law and the personalities of referendums play out in small jurisdictions. Okay. So first of all, I just want to thank everyone who's come along and shown an interest in small states. It really is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I've been involved in this study of small states from a legal perspective for about 10 years now. I founded the Centre for Small States at Queen Mary in 2015, and it's been a wonderful experience bringing me into contact with legal scholars, political scientists, economists, people from all different disciplines around the world, and it's been a really enlightening and engaging experience. So I'm very pleased to be able to continue with that with you here today. So the first thing that I really wanted to tackle in this discussion is one that is really at the center of any study of small states, because it makes a tremendous difference to the path that we go down. And that is the existential question of what is a small state? And we talk about this term small states, small island states, small jurisdictions, but what exactly do we mean about what do we mean when we talk about a state that is small? And there are essentially two different ways that we can categorize the small state. One is to take and is the most, sorry, I'll just start that again. The most common way is to begin with an objective measure. And typically what you'll see when people talk about small states is that they will define it according to the population of the state. And we've got a number of different measures that are in place around the world. The Commonwealth Secretariat and the World Bank use the figure of 1.5 million population. That includes about 40 states globally fall within that population category. But you can have others. You can go higher. For example, the UN, with its Forum of Small States, actually uses a figure of 10 million. And their Forum of Small States is headed up by Singapore and New Zealand. Or you can go down the other way. You can, another figure that's very commonly used is 1 million, and then right down to what's sometimes termed the micro jurisdictions or the micro states who have populations of less than 100,000. And that has been my particular interest too, in the very smallest of the small states. So population is certainly the most common, but it's not the only one that has been employed to determine whether a state is small or not. A couple of other measures that are often linked to population are the size of the territory and also the size of the economy, because traditionally it's been quite common that a state with a low population will also have a small territory in which that population resides. And because of that small population, it will also have a small economy. It will have low GDP per capita. Now, I should say that there are, of course, small states that buck this trend. We have some exceptionally wealthy states, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, even though they have small populations and small territories, do have strong economies. On the other side of the coin, we have some very large states like Papua New Guinea and Jamaica, which, notwithstanding their population, which is in the 10 million plus range, and they have, certainly Papua New Guinea has large territory, because they share the characteristics of small states, they tend to be included in that category. The other objective measure that we tend to use sometimes is the size of the government. So how large is the civil service? How large is the parliament? How large is the executive? What is the machinery that is needed to run the state? How many levels of government do we have? Is it a unitary state, a federal state? So essentially looking at the governance infrastructure of a particular territory. So those are the very commonly used objective measures. And as I said, there are about 40 or so states worldwide that qualify as small if we use one or other of those measures. We then also have subjective measures. And the two that are most commonly used are those of relational size and perceptual size. And this enables states which might not necessarily fall to be categorized as a small state by any objective measure. It allows them to come within the ambit of small state studies. So, for example, you might think that the inhabitants of San Marino or Monaco might well be rather surprised by, let us say, Sweden or Norway's claim to be a small state. They certainly haven't got small populations. They've got fairly large territories. They've got, very powerful economies and well-run, ordered governments. But if you're a citizen of one of those countries and you're comparing yourself to your neighbors, for example, Germany, France, Russia, the very large countries of Europe, you may well consider yourself in relation to those other states a small state, and therefore to share some of the characteristics that states that objectively qualify as small states share. The other criterion that I mentioned is perceptual size, and this really is very context dependent. So it depends on how a country sees itself in relation to other states. So it may well think of itself as perhaps not being very powerful, not having a large voice on the world stage, perhaps having limited diversity in its economy, and in a historically small population. And a very good example of this is New Zealand, which is actually where I'm from. It doesn't meet the population requirements. It has a territory that is the same size perhaps as Japan or the UK, has a reasonably strong economy, but nonetheless, because of its historical position in the world and its relative power that it has experienced, it considers itself to be a small state. So there are lots of different ways that we can think about a state being small. I like to verge on being inclusive rather than exclusive. So I'm very happy to adopt any of those perspectives, although I wouldn't go as far as some scholars have, who essentially say this is all too hard. We have too many definitions going on. They conflict with one another. You can't be a small state with a population of 10 million or a small state that has a territory the size of Alaska. Let us just give up the whole thing. So that's definitely not a viewpoint that I endorse. I do think that small states exist and are worthy of further study. I should also mention here that when I am generally talking about small states, I tend to include territories that are not necessarily states as they might be defined according to international law. So states that are in free association with a larger state or former colonizing power, subnational territories such as former colonies, or even just separate jurisdictions within a larger parent state. So any territorial entity that has a distinct body of law that applies within that territory, I would also consider worthy of consideration in the small states field as well. So that's just to set the scene as to what we're considering here. And then the next question I want to pose is, well, what does all this matter? Why should we be concerned about small states? What do they have to contribute to our understanding? And this is certainly a very long-standing view. Small states for many decades, probably until the early 1960s, were viewed as insignificant, not worthy of attention, of having little value to bring to our understanding of world politics or economics, tourism, identity, culture. The idea was simply that they were too small to be taken seriously, and they were too small to contribute anything of value. Now, since the 1960s, there's been a a real change in the way small states are perceived. And I just wanted to run through some of the arguments, particularly those relating to democracy, as to why it is important to have this focus on small states. And I'd particularly like to thank Democracy International for recognising that and organising this webinar so that we can talk about why small states are relevant, and especially to our practice of democracy. So the first argument for studying small states is simply that it enriches our understanding of any topic the more states and jurisdictions we include within our data set. We are simply going to learn more if we have more examples to look at. And just because they might be small in number or have minute governments or economies, that doesn't mean that there is nothing that we can learn from them. One characteristic of small states, because they are so small, they can often be quite agile in responding to crises or taking on new ideas. They can be quite socially and constitutionally inventive. They can be very responsive when you don't have to go through lots of different levels of government or have a large population to persuade of the value of a policy idea. So a number of small states actually can be at the forefront of our understanding of a number of different topics, which is why it's particularly unhelpful to exclude them from our consideration and think that only big states have got lessons to teach us. The second reason, and one that's particularly linked to the seminar, is that a number of studies over the years have demonstrated that small states are more democratic than larger states. And the way in which democracy has been employed in those particular studies has particularly focused on the features of representative democracy. So small states tend to have, they're more likely to have free and fair elections, they're more likely to have constitutional instruments guaranteeing human rights and civil liberties, more likely to have free press, independent judiciary, more likely to have good separation of powers, be free from corruption, and so on. So if you look at democracy indices like those compiled by Freedom House, for example, you'll find that small states tend to come out top of the list of the most democratic states. So that's something very interesting. A very interesting characteristic of small states is their commitment to democracy. And not only do they tend to be more democratic than larger states, they have democratic government for longer periods, and they are more constant in their experience of democracy. So I think that's something, a very good starting point for thinking about small states in this context. What we don't see, and this is why I think this seminar is so valuable, is we haven't really seen a study of the use of direct democracy in small states. All the discussion of democracy has been about representative democracy rather than direct democracy, which is a little bit strange because, of course, direct democracy is seen as the original form of democracy. It's seen as the purest form of democracy. So when we talk about democratic status and we don't look at direct democracy, there's clearly something missing, something that could perhaps undermine that conclusion about small states being democratic. When we do look at small states and direct democracies, we find that small states rank amongst the most frequent practitioners of direct democracy instruments, be that a government-generated referendum, a citizens-initiated referendum, be it local or national. It's small states which actually use direct democracy the most. I think in a recent study that analysed use of direct democracy globally that came out in 2023. Switzerland was number one, no surprise there. But the next 5 countries were New Zealand, the Marshall Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, Liechtenstein, and Palau. Now, I think that's not the exact running order, but the next 5 states were all small states. So I think that if we're trying to learn something about direct democracy, that small states are the natural place for us to be looking. They practice direct democracy more often. And I think that's really something that we've omitted previously to consider. The other thing that's very interesting about the way small states practice democracy is that they tend to exhibit a feature that's called hyper-personalization. Essentially, what this means is that the lines between public life and private life in a small state are very blurred, they often overlap, often referred to as the phenomenon of everybody knows everybody here. So you're quite likely as a politician in a small state to encounter your constituents just in your daily life, in the supermarket, walking down the street. You're quite likely to be related in some way through blood ties, marriage, school, business connections. And because small states tend to have small governments, the impact of 1 or 2 people can make a tremendous difference to the political life of the state. And then because of that person's connections within the wider community, there tends to be a spiraling effect. So it's very interesting to see how politics works in small states. So those, I think, are the 2 key reasons why we should be looking at small states and their use of direct democracy. I just want to close my section because I'm conscious that I'm coming up to the last 5 minutes or so, I think.
Yeah, last 5 minutes, but I think, I think we have some time. So if you want to speak,
all right, okay, that's fine. I won't rush then. I have a terrible tendency to eat into the time of my co-presenters, so I'm very conscious of not doing that here. So just essentially the third thing that I wanted to talk about was, having said that it's important to study small states, and in particular study how small states use direct democracy because of their frequent practice of it and this feature of hyper-personalization in their polities, is what can we know about small states and their practice of direct democracy? And one of the features that I alluded to earlier was that small states can be quite inventive, they can be quite agile, they can even do quite unusual things because they're not fettered by large bureaucracies or other external considerations in exercising their democracy. And so in referendums, and one example that I'd particularly like to draw upon is that of New Zealand. So I think in this study of states and democracies, I think New Zealand ranked 3rd after Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And New Zealand has a very wide-ranging set of referendum procedures. So it for nearly 100 years, it had a long-ranging set of referendums on alcohol licensing that persisted, I think, from 1911 through to 1987. So there were many referendums held both locally and nationally on that feature. They also, in the 1950s, began to hold a number of government referendums, and these referendums were on the typical subjects that referendums are held. So if you're familiar with the study of referendums, it's the usual suspects. In one corner, you've got large questions of the constitution and the electoral system, parliament, governance, and so on. And on the other hand, you've got big social policy questions. So questions about, in New Zealand in particular, the main focus has been on betting on horses and alcohol, and how long the pubs will stay open in the evening. Those have been the main social concerns in New Zealand. And the other form of referendum that they have in New Zealand is the citizens initiated referendum, which of course is exceptionally well used in Switzerland, but you tend not to see it in common law countries in particular. So there have been many, many referendums in New Zealand. And one thing that has developed, which has been attracted quite a lot of interest amongst direct democracy scholars, is a pattern or a model of referendums that New Zealand has developed, whereby they have a two-stage referendum, and the one or other of the referendums will also be a multi-option referendum. And this really flies in the face of traditional referendum practice. Traditionally, you get one question, you answer yes or you answer no. And the reason why that model has been adopted is generally because it's thought that it's too complex to propose multi-option referendums, or to ask the same question more than once. So it's easier just to keep it simple. If the government's going to implement the will of the people or respond to it in some way, we need a clear statement, and we just need a binary answer, yes or no. But what we've seen in New Zealand is something quite different. We have seen now a number of times referendums on the electoral system, two sets of referendums on the electoral system, and another referendum on the national flag of New Zealand, where people have been asked either a question about which option they would prefer. So which of these flags do you like, the current flag or these five alternatives, or which of the current, which type of electoral system do you prefer? Here are four options and so on. And the response from that first referendum has been used to generate a second runoff referendum, if you like. So essentially what we've got is what has been called a threshold referendum, with multiple options for people to express a view on, and then a refined referendum when we ask the specific question. And I just think it's a very interesting thing that has happened in a small state. And I think it really challenges the idea that people can't respond to complex questions through the device of the referendum. So I found that very interesting in my own studies. The other area where I think small states can tell us quite a lot about political practices in particular is in the field of decolonization. So some of the small states that are very frequent practitioners of referendums, and particularly in the North Pacific, are those which have had a very close relationship with the USA. Obviously, we've got a couple of states in the US, Oregon and California in particular, which have made fairly frequent use of direct democracy in their governance systems. And what you see is a transfer of a political practice from a large state to a small one in the design of their constitution by the colonizing power. So in countries like the Marshall Islands, federated states of Micronesia, or territories or states in free association like American Samoa or Guam, we have this embeddedness of the referendum as a typical way to resolve political questions. And so I think the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, American Samoa, all in the last couple of years, they've had, again, what I would consider quite complicated constitutional questions to answer, right down to questions about the identity of who might conduct an audit, the names of various political constituencies, questions about citizenship eligibility, up to 10 questions being asked in this referendum that are expected to engage with. But that referendum has followed off the back of a more sophisticated constitutional device, that of the Constitutional Convention. So you had a group of experts actually debating these questions, engaging with the populace, something that is much easier to do in a small state and enables the presentation of much more complex constitutional ideas to be put to the people. So what I think you can take from that is that you've had a constitutional device, if you like, brought into these states through colonization, made part of their constitution, but essentially it has become indigenized in that the small states have adapted these devices. They've finessed them, they've refined them so that they work for the small state. And again, I think that's a very nice example of the inventiveness of the small state, that they have responded imaginatively to a way of doing things that perhaps they would not have chosen to do if they had had free design over their own constitutional arrangements. So that I think that's a good place for me to conclude. I know that Peter's going to tell us even more about referendums in small jurisdictions, so I'm looking forward to hearing from Peter, and thank you all for your time and your patience.
Thank you very much. Before I just pass the microphone to Peter, just a small reminder that if you have any questions, you can ask them in chat already and not wait until the speakers finish their presentations, and we will just read them out. And then, Peter, you're very welcome.
So I'm hoping you can all see the presentation.
Yes.
Brilliant. I'm going to endeavour to build on the really rich conversation that Caroline has started by focusing on three particular jurisdictions and the way in which they have approached referendums, and some really what I think is interesting stuff emerging in the last couple of years. So I'm going to be focusing on referendums and what I'm garishly calling ultra soft referendums in the Crown dependencies. This is my first try out of ultra soft, so I'll be happily be corrected by colleagues and something slightly more elegant. So I'm going to introduce some of the important characteristics of the Crown dependencies, many of which will resonate from what Caroline has just said. Very quickly introduce the legal framework, so how the Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey have set up referenda, use of formal referendums in Jersey and Guernsey, and then this idea of ultra-soft referendums in the Isle of Man. So both the story of the non-use of referendums in the Isle of Man, and also some quite interesting things that have happened in the last 2 years, and then finish with some very quick thoughts in conclusion. So what do I mean for the Crown dependencies? It's an increasingly contested term. It's actually being challenged in all three of the Crown dependencies at the moment, but it's an umbrella term for the Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey's dependent territories. So I've marked them on the map. You'll see that they are geographically very closely associated with the United Kingdom. And the idea of Crown dependencies stresses some important commonalities. Lack of full international legal personality. So technically, they are not states. They are non-state jurisdictions, but they have an extremely high degree of autonomy. They all share a common relationship with the United Kingdom, an ancient one. Jersey and Guernsey, we're talking before the conquest of England by in the Battle of Hastings. Isle of Man, I would argue, end of the 14th century was when it definitely came under English dominance. It had been fought over by the Scots, the Irish, the Norse, and the Welsh at various times. Dependent territories within the European region. There is obviously also Gibraltar I could talk about, but that's categorised slightly differently, so I haven't today. Smallness, limited capacity. So the issue that Caroline raised about them having limits to how much they can actually do, even wealthy territories like these three, the absolute amount of budget they have to operate their political system is limited. And what I've described as intimacy, which Caroline talked about as hyper-personalisation, which has already been introduced as a concept. And they're all islands, so they have this element of insularity about them as well, which gives a very crisp demarcation between here and there, between us and them. So there's really, I think there are some interesting things about islandness as well as smallness. The legal framework is distinctive in each case, very different origins, and so one thing which you can do if you want to make a small democracies person twitch is assume that they know all small democracies in a way that you wouldn't necessarily if somebody who said, "Oh, I'm a US lawyer." Very different backgrounds, very different legal systems, but essentially they are now all parliamentary democracies whose constitution is based on a mix of customary law rules, legislation of the national legislature, by which I don't mean the United Kingdom, I mean the Manx, the Jersey or the Guernsey legislature, and of decreasing importance acts of parliament. So it's actually quite controversial to talk about decolonisation for the Crown dependencies, but there is something interesting going on there, which is not wildly dissimilar. So the national legislatures, so the states of Jersey, the states of Guernsey and the Manx Tynwald, are comparatively small. So Tynwald, for instance, is dominated by 24 directly elected MHKs. They are not subject to strong party institutionalisation. The strongest of these is Jersey, where we have, I think, 20% of members have a party affiliation. Isle of Man, of those 24 MHKs, we have 3 who are party members spread across 2 parties. So they are overwhelmingly national legislatures of independent politicians. And they are extremely potent within each jurisdiction. Scottish devolution is a pale comparison compared with the autonomy of the Crown dependencies. To give you one example, the Isle of Man made its own decisions about capital punishment and penal policy and legalising up until the 1960s. They set their own tax regimes, they set their own penal policy, just vastly more than Scotland does. So they have that in common as sort of their structural power. In relation to referendums, the Isle of Man has a Referendum Act, which is based on the UK Act of 1975. It's triggered by Tynwald, so it's actually triggered by the legislature, not the government. So it's triggered by Tynwald, and then the questions to be asked are drafted by a committee of the judges. There are 2 full-time judges on the Isle of Man, and the chief legal officer, who is a member of government. Jersey, the referendum's Jersey Law 2002 is the main legislation here. It's been updated a bit by 2017, but 2002 is the key one. As Caroline was saying, there's a lot of borrowing by small democracies, and the 2002 Act is based on UK models. Triggered by the states, so again, triggered by the legislature. Drafted by an interesting body. It's the states themselves, assisted by standing referendum commissioners. So there are people sat in Jersey who are permanently referendum commissioners, I think for a 10-year term, who are sort of summoned to action when a referendum is on the way. And then Guernsey, electoral system referendum, Guernsey Law 2018, so the most recent law, not as closely modelled on the UK model as the Jersey law, triggered by the states, drafted by the states. So the small legislature triggers a referendum and decides what the question will be. So how have these mechanisms been used? Caroline referred to where we would expect to find a clustering of referenda questions, and they're not a million miles off for Jersey and Guernsey. So in Jersey, we had a slightly quirky one, the adoption of Central European time. There was a referendum on that in 2008, which failed. And then the rest is the constitutional wiring type referendum. So a change of composition to the legislature in 2013, which was approved in the referendum, but not implemented. So these are all soft referenda. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the implications of the 2013 rejection. The change of composition in the States of Jersey in 2014, referenda failed. In Guernsey, we have a slightly maverick situation. Basically, Alderney, which is a dependency of the dependency of Guernsey, sends a certain number of members to sit in the Guernsey legislature. And Alderney held a referendum on how those members should be appointed, and Guernsey refused to recognise its legitimacy on the basis that Guernsey should be the body that held a referendum deciding whether or not to change this. So it was contested, approved but not adopted, changed the electoral system in Sark, which is another one of these dependencies, approved and adopted, and changed the electoral system for the states of Guernsey, approved and adopted in 2018. On the 2013 Jersey referendum, I just want to say that because it was approved but not adopted, so not given legal force by the states, there was consideration given as to whether or not there should be a mechanism for binding referenda in Jersey. And one suggestion was that when the states wanted to hold a referendum, they should first of all pass an act giving effect to the change being consulted upon, with a commencement condition that it be passed by the referenda. So you have the legislation dormant, and as soon as the referendum approves it, it kicks into effect without any more action by the state. I'll come back to this because I think it's been relevant and important in the Isle of Man a little later. So that's Jersey and Guernsey. So we can actually point to referenda which have been carried out, and they have refined their referenda in the light of their own experiences, as well as awareness of what's happening in larger neighbours. The Isle of Man introduced referenda in the law in 1979. There has been no formal referendum, so it has never been used, this piece of legislation. The first motion we can find is in relation to redistribution of seats in 1981, constitutional wiring. More recently, in relation to voting powers of members of the Second Chamber, direct election to the Second Chamber, constitutional wiring. Most recently, there's been an attempt to weave referendum into the commencement clause of controversial assisted dying legislation. So the Isle of Man looks set to be the first Atlantic archipelago jurisdiction to adopt an assisted dying regime. It is controversial. There is a majority in the legislature, but it's not a very, very strong majority. And interestingly, the Chief Minister is strongly opposed to the law. So he attempted to bring forward an amendment would say, yes, we can pass this legislation, but it cannot commence until after a confirmatory referenda. So inspired, I think, by Jersey. And very recently, literally last week, it was suggested that a referenda on the future of funding of Manx healthcare would be suitable for a referenda, which as Caroline sort of has already mentioned, is a much more complicated sort of question than the straight up and down that we tend to think of for referenda. So a number of attempts have been brought to bring about a Manx referendum. They've all failed. What sort of themes have the politicians rejecting them put forward? A big one is capacity. The expense of organising a referendum, it has been seen as a really significant problem. And some people have basically said, I would support a referendum, but only if we time it to coincide with the national election. We're running polls anyway, we've got all of that expense invested, let's freeload on the back of that. Intimacy. One rejection of referenda, which I think is interesting, is that in a small democracy, where you may have been elected by as few as 450 votes, so in a small democracy, you should already know your constituents. You should know the mind and the will of your constituents. You pick up kids from the same school as they do. You do your grocery shopping in the same place they do. You walk in the same parks and glens. So intimacy is actually, I think, being used as an argument against referenda in these really small micro jurisdictions. So ultra soft. Interestingly, literally in the last 18 months, there's begun to be a development of people trying and talking about using referenda without actually using referenda, without the expense and the formality of a proper soft soft referendum. I've mentioned the fact that the party institutionalisation is very low in the Isle of Man. This isn't to say that there isn't a bloc. There is a government bloc. So there's a number of ministers who are appointed by the Chief Minister who bring forward government legislation. And when they bring forward government legislation, it is considered by the legislature as of right. Everybody else, it's a private member's bill. And a private member's bill requires approval to even be developed. So you go to the legislature and say, I'd like to develop a private member's bill on phone tapping. And there's a straight up and down vote before you can even proceed to the first reading. We've had a number of controversial bills, which I would suggest are in this area of social legislation and perhaps socially divisive legislation, where the person seeking permission to bring the bill has offered to consult the Manx public. So if you allow me to bring this bill forward, I will consult the Manx public on what it should look like, how they feel about it. And we've seen this in relation to abortion reform in 2017, divorce in 2018, assisted dying in 2022. They were voluntary. The proposer put it forward, no doubt as a way to increase the chance of getting permission, but as, I will do this. In 2024, a private member's bill which had already received consent to be developed was derailed when a majority of the keys voted that it should be adjourned until the mover had consulted the public and submitted a report to the House. So this procedural step is introduced for this particular private member's bill. Okay, yeah, fine, you're developing it. Go away and consult to the public. But what does that mean? What does consulting the public mean in this sort of context where you have to do it in order to proceed? One of the reasons I think some people have been quite happy to derail private members' bill in this way, or have valued the reassurance about consultation, is there's a feeling that government bills have a backstory. They've gone through the government departments, they've been scrutinised by multiple people before they even reach the point of being considered in the legislature. Whereas private members' bills, particularly I think in a system without party structures, literally could be somebody's hobby horse. An MHK could introduce a private member's bill which nobody else had seen or consulted on or thought about and talked about. And there's a little bit of a hint that this public consultation is expected where there's social change, so the sort of socially divisive issues I've talked about, changes to the wiring of the Constitution, or perhaps changes to the relationship of the state and the individual, although that's more tentative. That's the assisted dying debate, some of the themes there. But I find this very problematic. There are no resources provided for the consultation and no set mechanism for doing so. So you've sheared away from the cost of a proper referenda, you've imposed this consultation requirement, and then you provide no resources to do it. To give you an example, it was assumed for the assisted dying legislation that, for the Lord Bishop's legislation, that the public could be consulted through the Isle of Man government website, which had hosted other private members' bills referenda. In fact, the Isle of Man government said, we've decided we're not going to do this. So not even a web page was provided to the MHK required to consult with the public. So there's no set mechanism for doing so, which I find very problematic if we start to move towards having it as a parliamentary procedure requiring this. No guidance as to what robust consultation might be. In the same debate, we had completely different visions of how it would be carried out, ranging from sort of, this will almost be a referendum, which you will do with no resources, down to, open up a web page or ask people to send you emails. And what I found quite interesting was that you had people who said you've got to consult. The proposer consulted, and they then voted against them being allowed to develop their idea because they felt the consultation wasn't sufficiently robust. How are you going to have a robust consultation with no resources, with no set structure for gauging these things? It feels very strange to me. And there's one particular problem which I think ties into this idea of insularity and islandness, which is the residency problem. So the requirement is typically you will consult with Manx residents. There isn't a Manx nationality as such, so it gets a bit complicated, but you'll consult with the 86,000 people who are resident in the Isle of Man. Great. How do I do that? And crucially, how do I exclude the rest of the world's population who might have something to say? Because if you think about the topics I've just covered, these are topics of global concern. Assisted dying is not just like a strange, weird Manx sort of thing. When the assisted dying consultation went out, it became obvious to me that a number of the very large number of poorly analysed responses they got were from Americans. So you have this thing where, okay, a small democracy, they're agile, they're nimble, maybe we can shift them in a particular direction or prevent a shift in a particular direction. So actually foreign involvement is quite a problem. Let me give another example. The most recent one, consultation on whether or not the Lord Bishop of Sodor and Man, the Anglican Bishop of the Isle of Man, should continue to sit and vote in Tynwald. Sounds like a very, very Manx concern. Information was circulated about this consultation across the Anglican communion. And you can imagine Anglicans with a very particular sense of what appropriate relationships are between church and state, having quite a strong view about whether or not an Anglican bishop should cease to be sitting in the national legislature. So I think this residency issue is really difficult. Because there are no resources made available, the obvious thing to want to do is to do all of this online. I talked to some technically savvy colleagues. It's incredibly hard to limit yourself, even in an island jurisdiction, technically. You know, people might use Starlink, people might use loads of different ways of hiding where they're coming in from. So I think the residency issue is a real problem for electronic consultation in a way which is worse than if you said, we're meeting in Derby Town Hall on Friday. Maybe somebody would get the boat over from Liverpool, but it's a much bigger commitment. So my final thoughts, intimacy of small democracies, particularly very small democracies, may seem to argue against a place for a referendum. But against that, worries about the concentration of power in a small number of elected officers, one aspect of what Caroline referred to as hyper-personalisation, may argue for referendums in relation to constitutional issues. You know, there's such a small bunch of us here, we all work together, we all know each other, maybe we shouldn't be changing the constitutional rules, maybe we need to reach outside our body through a referendum. Formal referendums can ensure views are gathered from the small national public. Anything less than a proper formal referendum, I think, is very difficult to protect. But formal referendums are complicated, use resources. So I think that's why we've seen members of the Manx Tynwald seeing these ultra-soft referendums as quite tempting. You know, we want a consultation, or we want to have at least the appearance of consultation, but we don't want to pay for it. And the last thing I want to say is I find it quite interesting that these are moving procedurally. So this isn't about the substance of should we have assisted dying, for instance. It's on what day should this bill come into effect? Or should you be allowed to introduce this bill within the legislature itself? And so I find that procedural turn quite interesting. So that's all I had to say about the Crown dependencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And yeah, I think now we can move to the questions and answers. And yeah, you can either raise your hand, you will be able to unmute yourself, or you can write your questions in the chat. And while you decide how you want to proceed, we had one question from Erwin Meyer. I don't know, Erwin, do you want to voice your question or I can just read it out loud? Yeah, the question was, I think, addressed to Caroline. Why in 2015? Because of the Paris Agreement.
So the answer is actually no. It's simply because of internal university processes. I had the idea around about, well, I had been interested in small states and jurisdictions for a long time, but it had taken quite a while for the idea to crystallize and then to be in a position to formalize that within a university research centre. And then obviously it takes quite a long time and a lot of committees to put it through. So it just so happened that it was in 2015. I'm not actually an environmental lawyer or involved in legal analyses of climate change or climate justice at all, although it is something that the centre focuses on because it is such a critical issue for small states. It is an existential threat to their very existence, and I think you can see that by the number of legal actions that are being spearheaded by small states seeking redress or to assign responsibility for what they are experiencing because of climate change. But the short answer is no, it was more university bureaucracy than any sort of wanting to mark a particular moment in the history of small states.
Yeah, thank you. If anybody else has a question, yeah, Kim, I think you will be able to unmute yourself now. Yeah,
I can. Hi. Hello. Thank you very much for your presentations. I found this super interesting. I was wondering why, Peter, why would you you call them ultra soft referendums, but I'm wondering if they should even be called referendums because I don't know, it just doesn't quite feel right because it's like
because
some
they're lacking so many of the protections we'd require for
Yes.
an expression of the electoral will.
Exactly. And I mean, Saber's petitions or like opinion polls, would be a consultation with the public or something like that. And we wouldn't call them a referendum.
Yeah.
Because
But I think the consultations have been phrased in the traditional straight up, straight down sort of way. So rather than consult with the public in order to get, particularly the bishops one actually, rather than consult with the public in order to gauge public opinion or to get the sort of insights you might get from a citizen's jury, the bishop's vote, he was required to put a yes/no question to the public. And then that percentage outcome was used repeatedly in the debates. So I agree. I think because it lacks the protection of a referendum, I think it lacks the legitimacy of a referendum. So it might be worthwhile me using a different term, but I don't think consultation gets it either. It's I don't know, a shadow referendum perhaps. It's something between the two. And I think those who support its use see it as being closer to a referendum than it actually is. And those who are much more sceptical see it as being either simply another consultation, formal consultation, or just a hurdle. You've asked me to consult and I'm not going to take it seriously, but you've asked me to do it, so I'll do it and then we'll press on.
Yeah, exactly. That's good. I mean, it's a weird constellation to already have members of parliament that are not allowed to introduce legislation. Because then you could argue what's the point of them.
Well, they can if they get 13 votes allowing them to.
13 votes
of the 24.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
That's actually, already then a decision making. Like that's already a decision making.
It is, but because so many of them are independents, there's not a party bloc which can block a minority. So it is unusual, and one of my concerns is that if this consultation phase becomes common for private members' bills, it becomes another way to choke out private members' bills and give more weight to government bills. But yes, it is weird.
Maybe if I could just have another question. I was trying to get in touch with governments from Pacific Island states, or government institutions. I was wondering if you had any advice because I don't get any answers. Sometimes I can't even find an email address, and then I message them on social networks, and it's crazy. How just like, I don't know.
Well,
I just can't.
Perhaps if I could chip in with this one, Peter, if that's all right. I mean, critically, I think in small states, community and who you know is very important. And I also think that being able to trust people who are not part of your community, and particularly, as Peter was saying, on islands where you've got that very clear demarcation between your land and everybody else, there is a hurdle that you have to get over. I remember I was doing some work on Alderney, and one of the smaller Channel Islands, and one of the first things that I had to do was go and have afternoon tea with a significant social figure on the island. Now, ostensibly, this was to talk to me about the project that they wanted to engage me on, but really it was to find out if I was a decent person and could be trusted to do that work. So I think there are those obstacles which are not necessarily deliberate, but they are reflective of a certain insularity. So what I would say is that you need a personal connection to introduce you to those people that you need to speak to. And that is by far and away the most, I think, effective and valuable way, because then once you're recommended by someone who is already effectively on the inside and who is trusted, then that will give you your entry. Particularly because, again, as Peter was saying, those small jurisdictions lack capacity. So in some of those small Pacific islands, there is such limited capacity. You have one lawyer, two lawyers. You have one person running the legal drafting department and having to do all that work, and they simply don't have time to do those things. So it can sometimes be a bit of a self-preservation mechanism as well. So what I'd suggest is just contact me afterwards. You can find me on the Queen Mary website, and I'll be very happy to introduce you to other people I know working in these fields in the Pacific, and hopefully I can help make some connections for you. I think that is probably going to be the best way to get you to move from outsider to insider.
That would be really nice. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I mean, that would be absolute gold. The only thing I would say is that in my experience, people who are actively involved in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association tend to be a little bit more receptive, I think, to outside contacts. So if any of the people you're trying to contact have a CPA branch, that could be a way in as well, but not as effective as what you've just been offered.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if any other of you have any questions, you can write them in chat, or you can click on the lower part of the menu on React, and there you will have option of raise your hand. But while you're writing or figuring that out, I actually have a couple of questions. I think we talked today a lot about the intimacy and closeness of the community. And because of that, and because also I think at Democracy International, we try to focus a lot, especially on bottom-up direct democracy. I wanted to ask first, how do you think widespread it is in general in small states, small island states, and this type of direct democracy, and in general, how binding is it? Do you have any insight on that?
Sorry, Anna, could you just clarify what you mean by how binding it is? Do you mean the influence of the hyper-personalization? Does it really exist?
Yeah, is the outcome legally binding, or is it just a consultation via voting, basically?
Oh, okay.
Or how authorities tend to follow up? Any of those?
I mean, I would say it very much depends on a particular state's constitutional arrangements. So some states have got very clear provisions in their constitutions as to the permitted topics for a referendum, who's eligible to vote, whether you have a threshold turnout or threshold for a yes vote. and whether those referendums will be binding or whether they'll be advisory. So I think it's a little bit difficult to generalize. In states where there are those constitutional provisions, those essentially government-initiated referendums do tend to be binding. So, for example, all of those examples that I talked about with American Samoa or Micronesia, Guam, and so on, the outcome of those referendums will be binding. I'm not really aware of governments refusing to implement referendum results that have been decreed in advance to be binding. I know in New Zealand, for example, the government has a long history of not responding to citizens-initiated referendums. So when the government will choose to hold a referendum and they specify that it's binding, then yes, they consider themselves bound by that. But citizens-initiated referenda in New Zealand have really suffered, I think. There was great enthusiasm for them 20 or so years ago when they were first introduced, a lot of questions being put forward, petitions being circulated, referendums being held under the Act. And then each time the government would essentially say, well, this is just binding. And they would throw a few crumbs to the initiators of the petition sometimes. So they would say, let us hold a review or make a small legislative amendment. But sometimes you would get very strong steer from the public. So, for example, there was a referendum on the repeal of an amendment to the Crimes Act that would make it illegal, was making it illegal to use smacking as a form of discipline in children. And it was a citizens-initiated referendum on it, and 88% of the voters said this should be repealed. Parents should have this right to discipline their children how they see fit, and the government simply ignored it. So even when you've got those very, very strong steers, I think the government in those senses has simply used the citizens-initiated referendum process as a way to let people let off steam about public policy or laws that they don't like. But the government, for the government, the legitimacy is all in the process. Put this question on the public agenda, let there be public debate, let people vote, but that's the end of it. The referendums that count are the ones that we initiate on cannabis, on assisted dying, on the voting system, term of parliament, those high-level constitutional and social policy questions, if you like. So I have seen in some jurisdictions a two-tier approach, really, to the utility of referendums and the responsiveness of the government. And Peter, I don't know if you have any experience.
Yeah, it's on the intimacy point, I think. I mean, I know this is a vibe that happens in larger countries, but one of the fairly strong suggestions was that when an MHK would suggest there should be a referendum, it was seen as an abdication of responsibility. And certainly in the Isle of Man, because you have quite a short political career typically, having done something else already, so it's a very volatile house. You often don't serve a second term, and overwhelmingly that's because you choose not to, rather than because you fail to get re-elected. You get quite a big incumbent benefit. So there's a sort of a bit of a tension, I think, in the Manx polity between, do we want politicians who are representative of our community, as in being like us? We can look at them and we can see that they are normal people rather than professional politicians. Or do we want professional politicians? And I think sometimes that emerges in relation to referenda, where it's seen as an abdication of your responsibility because you're in over your head. Oh, we don't know how to resolve assisted dying. Right, let's bang it out to a referenda. Which is an interesting vibe, which I think comes partly from intimacy. I don't know if Caroline would see that at all.
Sorry, just a sticky trackpad there preventing me from unmuting myself. It's an interesting point to consider, and I hadn't really thought of it in that way, because typically when you put a question to the people, it's a recognition of the greater legitimacy of their sovereignty. So in a sense, yes, it is saying we're not prepared to answer this question, but there's a very good reason. That's because this is a question that you should answer, not us. So I think that is interesting, that it is being essentially battered back to the politicians to say, well, it's your job to make these laws or make these decisions, so you do it. And I find that quite surprising that people would, I don't know, my point of view, the more democracy, the better, really. So I find it quite surprising that people would decline an opportunity to participate in big questions like this. I do find that interesting.
I think to me, it felt most pronounced in the public debate, not in the yes/no questions, like should the bishop have a vote, should they not have a vote, but in the suggestion that there should be a referendum on future funding of the Manx Health Service, because there was a feeling that this is actually the complex, multifaceted question that we have a health minister to resolve, and that you can't resolve it by asking the general public in quite that way, or certainly not without setting out a menu of alternatives. Because the subtext of this is, should there become private sector involvement in Manx health, which is really marginal at the moment, less than in the UK.
That's actually a very good point, because I think at the moment the government of England, the government in relation to the NHS in England and Wales has essentially just thrown this question out to the public about how should we make the National Health Service better, and of course has received, yes, some well thought out, carefully considered replies, but a lot of facetious responses as well. And of course, some poor public servant is now going to have to go through all of those, code them, analyse them, report on them. And yes, so I can certainly see that there's a very good reason for not letting the general public loose on that kind of open-ended question. I think it's worked in New Zealand because the questions, while they've been multi-option and nuanced, they've nonetheless been very clear, but they've also been limited. There's not been a free-for-all.
Thank you. There is one question from Klaus, and it's to Caroline. Smaller island states and decolonization. What are your thoughts on the role of culture and personal culture identification with the islands?
Well, I think there are two ways of looking at that. I mean, one is obviously deeply personal. So I'm from New Zealand myself, which is a series of islands, and now I'm living and working in Great Britain, which is another island, series of islands. I think there is something innate in your perspective on the world when you come from an island, and it's very hard to describe, but I feel there is something, it sounds slightly poetic about this, but there's a special place for the sea essentially, in that how the sea shapes your territory, how it shapes your nearness or your distance from your neighbours, how it shapes your economy, your isolation or your closeness. even your culture, songs and poetry, about the sea. So I think there is something very distinct about coming from an island, and academically there is a whole a field, island studies, or sometimes called Nisology, but I think essentially everybody calls it island studies, and it takes islands on their own terms. So what is special about coming from an island? You don't have that fluidity of borders. You might experience migration in a different way. You might experience colonization as a very distinct event rather than a gradual creep over the centuries. You definitely get that importation of ideas is very distinct. That if they come from overseas, they tend to arrive with a person or with a group that has migrated. So I can only say personally, but I think that distinctive island culture and identification as an islander is a real thing, and I think a very important thing if you are from an island.
Yeah.
I can see Peter agreeing with me.
Definitely. I mean, I'm from an even smaller island. I am from the Isle of Man, and I think there is something about insularity which has a strong cultural impact. Obviously, plays out differently for different islands, but also a very practical impact. You know, if you are a small island and you need access to specialist cardiac surgery, there is a disjunction between where you are now and where you need to be to access that, or where the person needs to come to access it. If you have need for specialist provision for prisoners, for instance, they are then exported not simply over a land border where they may only be 30 miles away. They're actually exported to somewhere which is so different because it requires this flight or this ferry. So I think I mean, it's good to see Tanya contribute from within the University of Malta, because I think islandness and smallness are very significant, as is rurality, but I think they are distinct facets.
I think Kim also writing another question. What's the difference between islands and remote rural villages without insularity?
I think it's partly the disjunction. So you know, when you're on an island, there is a definite you leave the island rather than simply move further and further away to access particular things. And I think quite a lot of the literature talks about the sense of shared community and shared islandness. And as in the 21st century, I think what's quite interesting is those discussions are drifting away from an ethno-nationalism. So there's much more sort of, you know, we are the community in this island, and some of us grew up here and some of us have joined voluntarily the island, but it's still a distinctive community bounded by the sea. So I think there are lots of connections with rurality. So I'm really pleased to see rurality in the law, for instance, starting to develop as an idea. But I still think there's something distinctive there. And just one more distinctiveness to add, talking with colleagues who work on small islands state, where, you know, for instance, you may have an archipelago spread out over hundreds of miles. I think the sorts of islands that I tend to work in, which tend to be one large island or perhaps a small number of largest islands, is again different from these small island states, which may be spread over a considerable amount of sea room.
Thank you.
Yes, if I can just add something there, the type of island that you're in, whether it's that one large island like Australia, for example, or an archipelagic state, it can even affect your practice of direct democracy. You know, referendums can sometimes take many days to conduct because you have to physically travel from one island to the next to transport the ballot boxes here and there, or some islands may be too remote for television coverage or to have people visit them for public debates. So there are not all islands are of of the same cut from the same cloth.
As you also can see in the chat, Klaus is also asking exactly kind of related to this question, how does this edification help to build direct democracy institution?
I think it's difficult. Not necessarily in relation to the insularity, but I would say it's more simply a question of more about direct democracy institutions. But what in other areas, what you see is small islands grouping together to share resources in order to make the most of the capacity that they do have. So, the East Caribbean Constitutional Court, for example, I think there are 8 member states using that as their appellate court. Or you've got OASIS, the Association of Small Island States. I think 14 states banded together in order to bring the request for the advisory opinion to ITLOS recently. So certainly a strategy that small states and in particular small island states have employed to overcome this lack of capacity and expertise is, I'm not aware of democracy, and I think that might come back to the colonization point, in that where you've got the largest concentrations of small states, they don't necessarily share a uniform experience of colonization. So, for example, in the Pacific, you've got Leste, which was originally colonized by the Dutch and then subject to Indonesian control, but you've also got former French colonies, former German colonies, former British colonies, former French colonies, and you've got Tonga, which was never colonized at all. So that's a very, very disparate set of experiences and approaches to the doing of politics and the role of direct democracy. I think that could be very hard when you haven't necessarily got that common experience or a common goal, such as having a common law constitutional court or a common enemy, the fight against climate change. I do see that disparity of experience could make it very difficult to band together in the field of direct democracy. I'm not personally aware of these sorts of things happening in relation to small states. So we've got the Institute of Referendums, the Initiative and Referendum Institute in Asia, which also covers some of the Pacific region, but that is very much a top-down body rather than small states coming together. So it's my short answer is I don't know. And I don't know because I think it was probably too difficult.
If I have to say that, I think that is a really great question. It's the one I'll be chewing over as we bring things to a close. But I would like to flip it round and answer a question I think I can answer, which is I think if you're not aware of the characteristics of small island democracies, that could be an obstacle to building direct democracy institutions, because they aren't the same. They aren't simply just quantitatively different. The combination of all the quantitative difference for small island democracies, to me, becomes a qualitative difference in how politics actually works.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think because we are running out of time, this probably was the last question answered. I just want to thank everyone who was able to stay until the end with us. And I want to thank especially Peter and Caroline for joining us and dedicating some time for this, for me at least, incredibly insightful inputs. Thank you very much. I think this was the last webinar of this year, probably, but we're definitely coming back next year. So stay tuned and have a nice evening.